Hello, my name is Maggie Weller. I'm 74 years old. And 2 months ago, my son looked me in the eye and said, I don't want to take care of a sick old woman. Then he kicked me out of the house I helped him buy. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. But I took one thing with me, a chipped teacup. And if you think this is just a story about aging, you're wrong. This is about memory betrayal and a quiet fight to be seen before it's too late. It's just a teacup, Mom. Stop clinging to junk like a crazy woman. The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Maggie's hand froze mid-reach, still holding the edge of the counter for balance. Her knees ached from standing too long, but she didn't sit down. Not yet. Ethan's voice wasn't angry, just flat. Annoyed, maybe. Like someone swatting a fly. She hadn't meant to drop it. Her hand had trembled the way it often did now. The teacup, the white porcelain one with the faded blue ivy pattern, had slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. Lauren appeared almost instantly, gliding across the spotless kitchen floor in her beige slippers. She crouched without a word, gathered the larger shards with a paper towel, and tossed them in the trash. "It's all right," she said sweetly. "These things happen." But she didn't look at Maggie, and she didn't mean it. The kitchen was too quiet after that. Maggie knelt awkwardly, ignoring the creak in her hip, and found a small piece under the table, a curved fragment, where the ivy still bloomed unbroken. She slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan without thinking. Her fingertips lingered on it a moment longer than necessary. It was warm. She stood slowly. Neither Ethan nor Lauren offered a hand. Breakfast resumed like nothing had happened. Ethan scrolled through his phone while sipping coffee. Lauren poked at scrambled eggs. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scrape of a fork. Maggie placed a slice of toast on her own plate but didn't eat. So Ethan said without looking up, "You remember you have a doctor's appointment this month, right?" His tone was casual, too casual. The way people speak to someone who's slipping, who forgets. "I do," Maggie said, her voice quiet. "That's good," Ethan replied. "Just making sure." She nodded, but inside something folded in on itself. She was no longer Mom. Not really. She was a task, an obligation, a line on the calendar. Ethan finished his coffee and stood. "I'll be late tonight," he said to Lauren, then to Maggie. "You'll be all right on your own." "Of course," she said. "Of course." He didn't wait for more. The door clicked shut behind him. Lauren rinsed the dishes without speaking. Maggie stood beside her, drying them with the thin, overwashed towel she'd brought from her old house. She wanted to say something, anything, but Lauren's posture discouraged it. After the last plate was shelved, Maggie reached for the broom and dustpan. The floor was clean, but she swept anyway. She moved slowly, methodically, as if erasing her presence might make her more acceptable. Her hand brushed over the cold marble of the countertop as she put the broom away. No one noticed. The kitchen looked as if she'd never been there. That evening, the sky dimmed early. October in Ohio did that short days, long nights, and the smell of decaying leaves through the cracks in old windows. Maggie sat alone on the edge of her bed, a heavy cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the heating system. She opened the nightstand drawer and took out her old wallet, brown leather frayed at the edges. Inside, tucked behind expired IDs and an old grocery list, was a photograph. She unfolded it, slowly smoothing the creases. A younger version of herself smiled up at her hair, darker shoulders, straighter. Next to her stood James, her husband, his hand firm on Ethan's small back. They were all laughing eyes squinting into the sun. That day at the lake. All of them were there. Now it was just her. That night, Maggie opened her old wallet and pulled out a faded photograph her husband, her son, and herself long ago, all smiling. Now only she remained. I didn't ask for this, Lauren. I'm not taking care of a sick old woman. The words floated out of the hallway like smoke, whispered but not hidden. Maggie sat in the darkened living room, her feet tucked beneath her hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea she no longer drank. The voices behind the half-closed door weren't meant for her, but they found her all the same. I thought we agreed. Ethan continued, his voice low but strained. We've got the kids, the mortgage, your job, this is too much. There was no response. Or at least, none that Maggie could hear. 2 days had passed since the appointment. Dr. Patel had spoken gently, used words like early stage and manageable. But nothing could soften the label Parkinson's. It had landed between them like a wet stone on a polished floor, inevitable, heavy, cold. Now, under the pale light of the kitchen that spilled only halfway into the living room, Maggie waited. She had sensed it coming, the way you sense rain, even when the skies are clear. Something had shifted. Ethan entered with the manila envelope in his hand, the one she had brought home from the doctor's office. He didn't sit. I've been looking into care options, he said without preamble. Maggie looked up. Care options. Ethan glanced toward the hallway, then back at her. His eyes didn't quite meet hers. You'll need support, Mum. Physical therapy, medication, routines. I work long hours. Lauren has her own schedule. It's a lot. I never asked for anything, Maggie said, voice thin. I know, he replied quickly. I'm not blaming you. He sat down finally across from her, the envelope still unopened. His fingers tapped its edge. There's a place called Cedar Hills. It's nearby. Clean, quiet. I think it would be good for you. Lauren stood by the kitchen sink, arms folded. She wasn't looking at either of them. Maggie's gaze dropped to her lap. Her handbag rested there, zippered heavy. She slid her fingers inside and found the fragment of porcelain smooth and cool. She held it like a stone, like a talisman. Is this what you've decided? She asked softly. Ethan didn't answer. Or maybe silence was the answer. The rest of the conversation was mechanical dates, transportation, logistics. Maggie didn't ask many questions. What was there to say? The next morning, a taxi waited at the curb. The air was sharp, with the smell of fallen leaves damp from overnight drizzle. Maggie stood at the door, her coat too thin, her scarf misaligned. Ethan handed the driver an envelope and turned back toward the house before she had even opened the car door. I've done my best, he said to no one in particular. Lauren didn't come outside. Maggie climbed into the car by herself. The driver offered to help with her small suitcase, but she shook her head. She didn't want to be touched. As the taxi pulled away, she looked back. The house stood still and silent, its windows glowing a soft amber from within. She spotted the one that used to be her room, the guest room they'd called it now. The curtain moved slightly, then stilled. She watched until the light disappeared behind trees and distance. Only the road stretched ahead, wet and endless. You'll get used to it here, Mrs. Weller. Most do. The voice was brisk, clipped, like someone reading from a script. Maggie stepped out of the taxi and onto the gravel path that led to Cedar Hills. The wind stung her cheeks. The building ahead, a red brick structure with ivy clinging to crumbling corners, looked less like a home and more like a memory someone tried to forget. Elena, the woman who had greeted her, wore a pale blue cardigan and sensible shoes. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Room 3B, she said, gesturing inside. Second floor, east wing. The air inside was warmer, but tinged with something stale disinfectant, And something else time, perhaps. Time sitting too long in corners. They walked past open doors. Some rooms were empty. Others held figures in recliners, eyes closed or turned toward flickering televisions. No one spoke. A few looked up, their gazes lingering just long enough to register a newcomer. Maggie felt their curiosity like a weight. Her room was small, bare walls, a narrow bed, a wardrobe that creaked when Elena opened it. The single window faced a skeletal maple tree and a narrow path beyond the lawn. Grey sky spilled light over the linoleum floor. "There's a weekly activity calendar by the dining hall," Elena said, placing a set of folded linens on the bed. "Meals are at 8 noon and 6. Nurse check-ins twice a day. If you need anything, press the red button by the door." "Thank you," Maggie murmured. But Eleanor was already halfway down the hall. Left alone, Maggie stood for a moment without moving. The silence felt different here, thicker. She opened her suitcase slowly, taking out familiar things: 2 sweaters, a bottle of aspirin, a small velvet pouch with old jewelry. At the bottom, under a folded shawl, she found the photo album. The leather binding was worn, the pages soft from years of flipping. She ran her fingers over the cover before opening it. There he was, James. In the third photo from the front, standing beside her at their 35th anniversary, his tie crooked, his smile lopsided. And tucked inside the back page, a cream-coloured business card. Charles Denning Esquibber Estate and Elder Law. The corners had curled slightly. Maggie stared at it, the name pulling her backward through time. She remembered James saying almost offhandedly as they folded laundry together one quiet evening, "If anything ever happens to me before you, call Charles. He's solid. He'll take care of you." She hadn't thought about that moment in years. Now it came back in full colour. Maggie closed the album gently, as if afraid the memories might slip away if she moved too fast. She placed it on the windowsill, then reached into her coat pocket and retrieved the small porcelain shard, the last piece of the teacup. She set it beside the album. The light outside had dimmed. She could see her own faint reflection in the window, layered over the trees and fading sky. Emotion caught her eye. Across the lawn, an elderly woman walked slowly along the gravel path. Her hair was white, gathered in a loose bun. She wore a shawl, pulled tightly around her shoulders. As she passed Maggie's window, she paused. Their eyes met just for a second. Then the woman turned and continued on. Not a word. Just the echo of soft footsteps in dying light. "You just have to ignore it. They cry at night. Most forget why." The words came from a shape in the dim hallway, small, hunched, wrapped in a woolen shawl and the hush of experience. Maggie had stepped outside her room sometime after midnight, barefoot and restless, drawn by the low, broken sound coming from down the corridor. It wasn't a scream, just a soft, rhythmic sobbing barely louder than the ticking of the hallway clock. Rain pattered lightly against the window panes, thin and cold. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else older, like the stale dust that gathered behind wardrobes. Maggie turned toward the voice and saw the woman sitting near the vending machine, a ball of pale green yarn resting on her lap. She moved her needles slowly, rhythmically, like someone playing a quiet tune only she could hear. "I'm sorry," Maggie said gently. "Did someone fall?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were clouded but steady. "They cry," she said again. "Sometimes from pain. Sometimes just because it's dark. Sometimes because they've forgotten what they were supposed to remember." She spoke plainly, not unkindly, just as a fact. Maggie stepped closer. "What's your name, Janet?" A slight smile. "You're new." "Yes, I'm Maggie." Janet's knitting paused. "Maggie Weller." Maggie blinked. "Yes, you were married to James Weller." Now Maggie paused. You knew James, I did. Janet said, a softness in her voice now. A long time ago. We all used to gather in Cincinnati before the kids, before the arthritis. He had a laugh that made everyone feel braver. Maggie felt a warmth rise in her chest that startled her. Something gentle, like recognition. Like being called by her full name after weeks of being simply Room 3B. They sat there in quiet for a while. Janet resumed her knitting. The crying down the hall had faded into a low murmur, then silence. From the corner of her eye, Maggie saw a shadow glide across the end of the hallway. Elena, holding a clipboard, not rushing, just walking, checking, noting. When she reached them, she didn't smile. Mrs. Weller. Ms. Dowling. Everything all right? We're fine, Janet said without looking up. Elena's gaze lingered on Maggie, then slid to the photograph Maggie held, an old snapshot she had brought into the hallway from her room. Her and James, arms around each other, the ocean behind them. Good, Elena said after a moment. Let me know if you need anything. Her eyes stayed a beat longer on the photo, then she turned and walked back the way she came. Maggie watched her go. Something about Elena's movements, too quiet, too deliberate, made her unsettled for the first time. Like being watched, not cared for. She's always listening, Janet muttered softly. She doesn't miss much. Back in her room, Maggie placed the photo on the windowsill again, next to the fragment of porcelain. The sky was beginning to fade from black to charcoal. She didn't try to sleep again. When morning came, she moved slowly. The smell of oatmeal drifted faintly from the dining room 2 floors below. Outside, the wind had blown all the leaves off the trees. Eleanor appeared by her doorway as Maggie buttoned her cardigan. Your son called last night, she said, her voice low. Again. You still keep paper? Most people just text. Or vanish. Janet's voice drifted through the half-open door, tinged with bemusement, as Maggie sat hunched over the small desk in her room. The rain had returned, not a storm, but a slow, deliberate drizzle that painted streaks across the yellowed window pane. The room was dim, though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. Maggie didn't look up. Her pen hovered above the lined page of a battered notebook she'd found tucked inside her suitcase between folded scarves. She hadn't planned to bring it. She'd barely packed anything herself. But now, with the wind hissing outside and silence inside, the urge to write had crept back in like a persistent echo. I find it helps, Maggie murmured. Janet stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, a habit Maggie was slowly learning to accept. She settled into the armchair by the door, her shawl wrapped tightly, knitting nowhere in sight today. Write for yourself, Janet said. Not for your son. Not for that woman who answers his phone now. Not for the nurses. Especially not for Eleanor. I'm not writing for anyone, Maggie replied. I just need to remember what's real. She paused, then reached into the drawer and retrieved the cream-coloured card again. Charles Denning Esquire Estate and Elder Law. She flipped it over this time. Her breath caught. On the back, in James's unmistakable scrawl, were 7 words. If you're ever scared, call him. J. The ink had faded, but not enough to erase the weight. I don't remember seeing this before, she whispered. Janet leaned in slightly, her brow furrowed. You were married to a good man, the kind who planned ahead. Maggie nodded, fingers brushing the edge of the card. A soft knock interrupted them. Elena stood at the doorway, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Her eyes, as always, were unreadable. Mrs. Weller, it's time for your blood pressure check. Maggie stood slowly, slipping the card back into the notebook. As she approached, Eleanor's gaze flicked downward just for a second, toward the notebook. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. Your writing, Elena noted. Just memories, Maggie said evenly. Elena nodded, but didn't smile. After she left, Maggie sat back down. The room felt colder now, despite the radiator humming in the corner. She opened the notebook again, turned to a blank page. Her pen trembled for a moment. Then she wrote, "Dear Ethan, I am not dead yet." The words sat there stark and unadorned. Not a threat, not a plea, a declaration. And as she stared at them, something stirred. A flicker not of anger, but of clarity. She leaned back and closed her eyes. Rain tapped the window like slow fingers, and somewhere between the rhythm and the quiet, a memory surfaced. James, sitting on their porch one warm spring night, holding a mug of tea, had said Ethan's got a good head, but he shouldn't be the one holding the will. If anything changes last minute, I want Charles involved. She had brushed it off then. A stray thought. A tired man, planning for shadows. But now she wasn't so sure it had been just a thought. You're not the only one who was forgotten, Mrs. Weller. Janet's voice was soft, almost lost beneath the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet. The two women walked slowly through the small rear garden of Cedar Hills. The afternoon was grey, with low clouds, casting a silver pall over everything. A breeze tugged gently at Maggie's scarf, and birds flitted nervously between bare branches. Maggie turned to Janet, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Janet paused near a damp stone bench, brushing it with her sleeve before sitting down. "James. He used to come here once. Long ago, before the place changed hands." Maggie's breath caught. My James Janet nodded. "He visited someone. I don't know who, but he used to sit right there." She pointed to the bench across from hers with a younger man. Talked quietly. Serious looks. "You remember how he looked when something was bothering him?" Maggie sat slowly. "I didn't know he ever came here. He never said." Janet gave a small shrug. "Maybe he didn't want to worry you." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but thick with thought. Maggie let her eyes wander. The garden, despite its wear, had a kind of forgotten peace. Fallen leaves gathered in corners. The cement paths were cracked, but moss softened the edges. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the cream-coloured card again. Charles Denning. She turned it over. Her fingers brushed James's faded handwriting like it was a thread to the past. "I remember," she whispered. "James once said something about, 'If anything ever happens to me, Charles will know what to do.' It was about some document, a protective clause. I thought he meant a will." Janet leaned closer. "Sometimes men do things in silence to protect the ones they love." Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse for the small cell phone she rarely used. The interface was unfamiliar, and it took her a few seconds to type in the number printed beneath Charles's name. She held the phone to her ear. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then, "This is Charles Denning. Leave a message." The beep echoed too loudly in the quiet garden. She hesitated, her thumb hovering near the end button. Then slowly, clearly she spoke. "It's Maggie, James's wife. I need help. Please call me back." She ended the call and sat in stillness. Janet didn't speak. The wind stirred the leaves again, swirling them like scattered pages. They walked back to the building in silence, the fading light casting long shadows along the hallway. Later that night, Maggie sat on her bed, notebook closed hands, folded atop it. She had turned off the overhead light, letting only the lamp by her bedside glow softly. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Then the phone rang. Shrill, unexpected, and unmistakable. Sometimes the answers don't come from the people you trust. But from the papers, they forgot to burn. The phone call had come just after dawn. Maggie was sitting by the window watching frost dissolve from the sill when it rang. Charles's voice was steady, calm, but there was tension beneath the surface. I found it, he had said. The original will. James had you listed as the sole inheritor, dated 2018. Maggie pressed the phone tighter to her ear. Then why? Why was I told nothing? Because in 2021, Ethan submitted a revision, one that removed your name entirely. But the 2018 version, James gave me a sealed copy, and he told me he left a second one, somewhere public, in case of trouble. Did he ever mention where Maggie didn't answer immediately? Her mind was already sifting through images and fragments of conversations. A bench in the garden, James's hand on hers. The sound of pages being sealed in an envelope. If I'm not here one day, he'd said you won't have to argue with them. Just find the record. It'll speak for me. It wasn't much to go on, but Maggie felt a pull, a certainty that sharpened with every memory. She called a cab. The Illyria Public Library sat low against the grey sky, a squat brick building with narrow windows and iron railings, slick from rain. Inside it smelled of old bindings and mildew-warm dust and something faintly floral from a janitor's mop. The archive room was near the back, through a creaking wooden door labelled Public Records Historic Holdings. The lights here were dim, casting an amber wash over rows of metal cabinets and manila folders. Maggie approached the front desk, explained her request, and was led by a young assistant named Mark. He walked slowly, sensing her age, and spoke softly as they arrived at a side cabinet marked Weller. We have something marked from 2018. It's in storage box 4C. He placed the box on the desk and stepped away. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside was a thick file folder labelled Weller, 2018 Protective Will. She drew a slow breath. The folder was sealed with a red sticker under legal review, pending executor authorization. Her throat tightened, but still she opened the cover. A few sheets in, she found it a page folded in half, with James's familiar handwriting scrawled on the front. If you're reading this, something went wrong. Her hand rested on the edge of the paper. Her chest felt tight, but not from fear. Something older, heavier. A sorrow that had begun the day James died and had never quite found a place to settle. She hadn't even had a chance to speak at his memorial. Ethan had handled it all quickly, efficiently. At the time, she'd believed it was grief. Now she wondered if it had been strategy. She turned the page. Everything was there. James's signature. The clause naming her as the inheritor of all joint assets. Language about long-term care protections and guardianship avoidance. It was real, and someone had tried to erase it. She didn't notice the young man return until his voice cut through the hush. "Ma'am, this file has been flagged. I have to call the estate executor. I don't know what your mother is up to, but she's been digging." Lauren's voice crackled faintly through the speaker, a half-whisper caught by a background mic. Maggie sat upright on her narrow bed, the tablet propped before her on a stack of worn books. Ethan's face filled the screen, smiling, but thin-lipped eyes tired. Behind him, through a blurred video background, Maggie caught a glimpse of their kitchen. Her old tea kettle still sat on the stove. She didn't mention it. Instead, she folded her hands and asked evenly Ethan, "Why did you change your father's will?" Ethan blinked once and then looked down as if reading something off-screen. "That's a complicated topic, Mom," he said gently. "Let's not rehash the past. It's not good for your health. I just want the truth." "The truth," he said, his voice firmer, "is that you're safe. You're being taken care of. That's what matters." Behind him, Lauren's voice, again muffled but tense. She's starting to remember things. What if she contacts someone? Maggie's lips thinned. She didn't speak. Ethan turned back to the screen. Mom, I know this is hard, but digging into old paperwork, stirring things up, what good does it do? I need to know what James wanted, she said quietly. He gave a tight smile. Sometimes even good men make mistakes in paperwork. Let it go. Trust me. Then the screen went dark. An hour later, her tablet buzzed. A message. From Lauren. What are you doing? Don't ruin this for all of us. Maggie read it twice, then powered off the tablet. Her room felt smaller than usual, the air stale despite the open window. Outside, the brittle limbs of the oak tree scraped lightly against the wall. Dusk had begun to settle soft grey, uninvited. A knock. Eleanor stepped inside, holding a tray with a teacup and a folded blanket. She didn't speak, just placed them gently on the table and turned to go. But before she did, she paused, resting a hand on Maggie's shoulder. Their eyes met. For a moment, Maggie saw something there, not sympathy, not pity, recognition. When Eleanor left, Maggie turned to her notebook. She flipped past the earlier pages, each one filled with cramped, looping handwriting, until she found the next blank space. She wrote, "They want me to forget. But I have remembered enough." She capped her pen and stared at the wall. Later that night, her tablet chimed again. An email from Ethan. Subject: medical evaluation request. She opened it slowly. The message was short, professional, and addressed to Cedar Hills administration. "I worry she's becoming unstable. James once told me, if I die before her, make sure she keeps her name." Janet's voice trembled just slightly, as though the words had been held too long behind her ribs. She and Maggie sat side by side on the bench behind Cedar Hills, wrapped in the quiet stillness of dusk. The late autumn sky was painted with purples and steel grey. Somewhere beyond the trees, a crow called once then again. Maggie turned to her. "He said that to you." Janet nodded, eyes steady. "He came here in 2019. Just once. I remember it like yesterday. He looked tired, worn, but alert, like a man watching for shadows. Why didn't he tell me he thought you were too kind, too trusting?" Janet paused. "He said Ethan was good at hiding things, and that if something ever happened, he didn't want you bullied. His words, not mine." Maggie sat very still, her gloved hands folded in her lap. I thought he trusted Ethan. Maybe he did. Once. But not near the end." The wind picked up. Dry leaves rolled along the garden path like discarded secrets. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maggie felt something inside her settling, clicking into place, like the final tumbler in a locked door. Janet reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pen. "Do you have paper?" Maggie opened her notebook to a blank page. "Will you sign a statement that James came here? That he spoke of Ethan?" "Of the will." Janet didn't hesitate. She wrote slowly, clearly. Her handwriting was firm, shaky only in the loops of her signature. When she finished, she placed the pen down and looked at Maggie. "I hope this helps. I've seen too many mothers erased here. One more would break me." Maggie pressed her hand over the page, feeling the ink's faint ridge beneath her fingers. She thought of James, his quiet voice, his careful plans. He had been trying to protect her even in death. And now, finally, she had something real. Not just memory. A witness. A voice besides her own. The screen of her phone lit up. She hadn't realized she'd already opened Charles's number. She tapped call. When he answered, she said only one thing. "We're not alone anymore. Let's move forward. She's just old, not crazy. and she remembers everything. The words came not from a doctor or a lawyer, but from Janet, spoken with quiet resolve as she looked across the common room table. The morning mist still clung to the windows, casting everything in a pale, muted hue. A faint scent of burnt pastry lingered in the air, mixed with the bitterness of watered-down coffee. Maggie clutched a small recording device in her lap, the red light blinking softly. Her hands trembled slightly, not from illness, but from gravity. "You're sure you're ready?" she asked. Janet smiled, her lips thin. "What are they going to do?" "Throw me out. I've already lived long enough to stop being afraid." Maggie pressed the record button. For the next 5 minutes, Janet spoke. Clearly, slowly. She recalled James's visit in 2019. How he looked tired, how he mentioned doubts about Ethan, how he insisted Maggie be protected. She even remembered James calling Charles Dunley by name, describing him as the only person he trusted with legal matters outside the family. When she finished, Maggie clicked off the recorder and slid it into a small padded envelope. Across the room, a chessboard sat untouched. A resident with trembling hands moved a knight absent-mindedly alone. No one spoke. Time here didn't move, it lingered. Later that morning, Maggie sat at the small desk in her room, her back straight, despite the ache in her lower spine. Charles had emailed her the legal forms. She had printed them with help from the front desk, then spent an hour checking each line witness statement, audio file, transcription, and a formal request for re-evaluation of the 2018 will. With care, she signed her name on the final page, Margaret Weller. The ink bled slightly on the page. She folded everything into a thick envelope, sealed it with 2 strips of clear tape, and wrote the address in capital letters, Cuyahoga County Probate Court. When she looked up, Elena stood in the doorway. The younger woman stepped in, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked from the envelope to Maggie's face. Charles Dunley. Elena said, more observation than question. Maggie didn't reply. Elena took a step closer, then gently rested her hand on the envelope. "I'll make sure it's delivered." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the old clock above the window. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't ask for help. She didn't thank Elena. She just nodded. Not in gratitude. In recognition. Of agency. Of something being reclaimed. That night, Maggie sat at her window, the sealed envelope gone from her desk. Outside, the garden lay motionless under a heavy sky clouds, like bruises stretching over the moon. She held her notebook in her lap, the leather soft from use, and opened it to a fresh page. She wrote in careful cursive, "They don't expect us to remember. They count on silence, confusion. But we are not broken, not lost. We are watching." She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest. The fabric of her sweater still carried the scent of the envelope glue, a strange, bitter reminder that her voice now lived inside a sealed package en route to the courthouse. The next morning, a message waited for her at the front desk, a printed email from Charles. Subject: update body. "The court has received the documents. You did everything right. Hearing scheduled December 12th, 10 a.m. Stay steady. C. Dunley." Maggie stood motionless for a beat longer than necessary. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, but her eyes stayed clear. 10 minutes later, she found Janet sitting in the common room, humming a melody that had no name. Maggie sat beside her and simply said, "It's happening." Janet gave a single nod. "Then it's time." At lunch, Eleanor passed by the table, pausing only for a second. "They'll probably try to push back. Expect a wellness check or a psych consult soon. That's how it starts." Maggie blinked. "Thank you." Elena didn't answer, just moved on. Back in her room, Maggie looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back had deep lines, silver strands escaping her bun eyes rimmed with fatigue. But behind all that, something sharpened. Not rage, not revenge. Clarity. That night, as the halls dimmed to low lighting and most residents retreated behind closed doors, Maggie sat up in bed and looked out again through the window. She whispered more to James than to herself. "We're still here, love. I'm not gone yet." And somewhere beyond the walls of Cedar Hills, in a courthouse office lit by fluorescent lights, a clerk typed her name into a docket system and saved the file. Margaret Weller versus estate of James Weller. Hearing scheduled. December 12th, 10 a.m. They used to say she was confused. Now they say she's dangerous. Elena closed the office door behind her with deliberate care. The tone in the administrator's voice still rang in her ears, clipped, irritated, and full of quiet threat. "This is assisted living, not a legal circus," he had said. "We provide peace, not lawsuits. Control your floor, Elena. Or we'll find someone who can." Outside the window, autumn wind scattered brittle leaves down the stone path. Inside, the air felt still, like something holding its breath. Back in her room, Maggie folded laundry with practiced slowness. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't rush to pick it up. When she finally answered, Ethan's voice snapped through the speaker. "Why are you dragging our name through court, Mom?" She paused, her hand resting atop a soft cotton shirt. "I'm not dragging anything," she said calmly. "I'm reclaiming my name." "Not yours?" The line went quiet for a moment. "You don't know what you're starting," Ethan muttered. "I know exactly what I'm finishing." Maggie replied, then ended the call. That afternoon, Elena found herself alone in the file room. Dust lay thick across the top shelves. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just moving papers, pretending, but her mind replayed that conversation. They tried to erase her. The phrase sat heavy in her chest. They'd used that word before, erase, when referring to other residents. Not overtly, not cruelly, but with administrative ease. Forms filed, medications adjusted, memories reshaped by silence. And now this woman, this quiet, trembling Maggie Weller, was about to change all of that. Elena opened her laptop, typed a short sentence in the subject line of an anonymous email, and hit send. Subject. They tried to erase her. No body, no signature, just the headline. Somewhere in the city, a journalist would read those words and pause. That evening, Lauren called. Maggie recognized her daughter-in-law's number, but didn't expect tears on the other end. "I didn't know," Lauren whispered. "I thought you were fading." "Ethan said you didn't remember things." Maggie's voice was soft, but steady. "I was fading. But even fading stars still shine, Lauren." There was silence, and then a quiet sob. "I didn't want this," Lauren said. "I just didn't know how to stop it." Maggie closed her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether to comfort her or let the silence speak for itself. "I hope you find your voice too," she said finally, and hung up. The next morning, a call came to the front desk. A reporter from the Illyria Chronicle wanted to speak to Margaret Weller, not about health, not about memory loss, about her story. "They called me Mrs. Weller. Not that old woman. Not the burden. Just Mrs. Weller." The sun slipped gently through the faded curtains, casting a quiet glow across Maggie's room. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was soft, the kind of light that didn't demand attention, only offered presence. Maggie had woken early. Too early, maybe, but sleep had long since become a series of shallow visits rather than a full stay. She sat at the small wooden desk, its surface scarred by time and water rings. Her hand moved steadily over the page. No one owns my name but me. She set the pen down and closed the journal, binding it with a piece of twine. It was heavier now in all the right ways. Across the room, the little porcelain teacup lay in pieces, still though not scattered. Carefully, Maggie took out the small tube of adhesive she'd asked Elena for 2 days ago. She fit the pieces together, her hands not shaking today. It wasn't perfect, the cracks still showed, but it stood, whole again, if not untouched. She placed the cup gently inside her coat pocket. It clinked lightly against the lining. "Still with me," she murmured. The room smelled faintly of lemon balm tea. A knitted scarf sat folded neatly on the foot of the bed. Janet had left it there before sunrise with a note James would have been proud. Maggie pressed the scarf to her cheek, then draped it over her shoulders. It matched the grey coat James had worn every Christmas morning. Down the hall, the floor creaked under soft slippers. Doors remained closed, but behind each one, a heartbeat listened. As she passed, Maggie felt it not noise, not applause, but acknowledgement. Eyes followed her from cracks in doorways, from behind newspapers, from wheelchairs, paused mid-corridor. No one spoke. No one needed to. Janet stood near the lift. She didn't smile, but her hand brushed Maggie's arm gently as they passed each other. At the bottom of the stairs, Elena waited. Her posture was formal, but her expression wasn't. With quiet fingers, she reached forward and fastened the top button of Maggie's coat. "You're not invisible anymore," she said. Maggie nodded. Outside, the morning chill greeted her with a firm but fair handshake. The driveway glistened faintly from last night's frost. A car waited, engine humming low, the driver standing by with a clipboard. "To the county court?" he asked. Maggie stepped into the sunlight. It fell over her like something sacred. "Yes," she said, steady and clear. "To my name." "Ma'am, you don't have to say much. The papers speak for themselves." Charles had said that with calm assurance as he adjusted his tie and handed her the manila folder. He didn't offer a pep talk, just a gentle glance, one that reminded Maggie she didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Not today. The courthouse smelled of old carpet disinfectant and dust, like memory preserved in a jar. The waiting bench outside the hearing room creaked as she sat down, smoothing the sleeves of James's old wool coat. It hung on her smaller frame now, but the weight of it gave her strength. Her gloved hand rested on her handbag. Inside, the mended teacup nestled between tissues and the neatly folded letter Charles had prepared for her. When the door opened, the bailiff gave a respectful nod. "Mrs. Margaret Weller, we're ready for you." She stood. Her legs did not shake this time. Inside the room was smaller than she imagined. No grand jury box, just a simple table and 2 chairs facing the bench. A few observers, silent, scribbled notes. Ethan sat across from her, flanked by a lawyer who looked far too young to understand anything about legacy. Lauren was beside him, pale, clutching her handbag like a shield. Charles' rose voice even. "Your Honour, we're here to request reinstatement of the 2018 will of the late James Weller. We contend that the 2021 amendment was filed under undue influence and does not reflect the true wishes of the deceased." The judge, grey-browed and calm, nodded once. "Proceed." Charles began with the facts, the original 2018 will notarized and stored under dual custody. The protective clause James had included that specifically stated, "Maggie shall not be removed from the home or her name from the estate without due cause." The testimony from Janet, verifying James's worry that Ethan might turn on his mother. Ethan shifted in his seat. "Your Honour, if I may, my mother's not well. She's forgetful, she's been confused." Maggie didn't flinch. Charles looked to her. She met his gaze, nodded once, and slowly rose. There was no speech written, no indignation, just movement. She reached into her handbag, pulled out the small porcelain cup, its crack still visible, sealed now with translucent glue, and placed it gently on the table in front of her. The room fell into a silence that felt deeper than stillness. "I broke this," she said, her voice even, but layered with something older than pain resolve. "I didn't throw it away. I mended it. Because some things still hold meaning even after they've been shattered." She looked at the judge. "My husband James kept me in that will because he trusted me to hold on. He didn't ask for me to fight anyone, but he did ask that I not be erased." Across the room, Lauren let out a shaky breath. Ethan glanced toward her, but she looked down. Maggie remained standing. The judge leaned forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Weller." She returned to her seat, one deliberate step at a time. The judge adjusted his glasses, then turned toward Charles. "Anything further before we consider testimony?" Charles glanced toward Janet, seated quietly near the back. She stood. "No need to call her. I knew James Weller." She began, her voice raspy but firm. "He visited Cedar Hills once just after filing his will. He was worried. He told me, 'If I go first, make sure Maggie keeps her name. I don't want her buried while she's still breathing.'" Janet's words didn't echo, they settled. Like dust disturbed by truth, they lingered in the air as the courtroom paused. Ethan shifted again, but he didn't interrupt. His jaw tensed, hands clenched together on the table. Maggie didn't look at him. She was still looking at the judge, never raising her voice, never asking for pity, just waiting to be seen. The judge nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Laramie." He tapped the edge of the folder in front of him, the one Charles had placed on the bench. "The documents are in order. The testimony is corroborated. There is no legal basis to disregard the 2018 will of James Weller." Maggie closed her eyes, not in triumph, not in relief, but in a quiet return to herself. Across the aisle, Ethan exhaled sharply, not in frustration, in something colder, like the hollow wind of a door closing behind you. He didn't speak. For the first time in the entire process, his mouth had no words. Lauren reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. The judge continued. "This court recognizes the original document as binding. All rights, responsibilities, and named beneficiaries shall reflect the terms therein." He looked at Maggie once more, his tone softening. "Mrs. Weller, this means the house and assets listed under your name remain under your authority as your late husband designated." Charles gave a small nod, more to her than to the court. The gavel fell with a firm but measured knock. "This hearing is concluded." Maggie stood. So did Ethan. But his body moved slower than before. His face was pale, not furious, but fractured. Like someone realizing too late that power doesn't always protect you from consequence. As the room emptied, Ethan lingered. Maggie met his gaze, steady, unsparing, but not cruel. Her voice was low. "You'll need to find your own name now." Ethan blinked. She didn't wait for a reply. Charles offered her his arm as they stepped out into the cold December light. The sky was pale, cloudless. The wind cut sharp, but Maggie didn't shiver. Her coat was warm. Her spine was straighter than it had been in years. Behind them, the courthouse doors swung shut with a quiet thud. Ahead, the path was open, not smooth, but hers. In her coat pocket, the mended cup didn't rattle. It simply rested whole in its own way, like she was. "The law gave it back to me, but I was never gone." That thought settled over Maggie like the morning fog blanketing the windowsill. Thin mist curled along the edge of the glass as light filtered through sheer curtains. The winter air hung still and cold, but inside her room, it was calm, her calm. Not sterile, not assigned, not borrowed. Hers. She sat on the side of her bed, folding the soft flannel sheets she'd chosen herself. There was no fanfare, no one applauding outside. The court case was over, the estate restored. But no one had thrown a party for dignity returned. And that perhaps was fitting. Some victories weren't loud, they simply allowed you to keep living without apology. Janet appeared at the door without knocking, carrying a small glass vase filled with fresh violets. "I thought your windowsill looked a little bare," she said, placing them gently beside the old photo frame. Maggie smiled. "They're lovely." Janet gave a knowing nod. So are second chances. Later, Eleanor stopped by. Her steps were quieter now, not hesitant, but reverent. She stood for a moment at the doorway before speaking. "I just got off the call with the board. They've officially closed the case. No further questions about your capacity." Then after a pause, she added, "You don't need to attend the re-evaluation next month. Unless you want to." "I don't," Maggie said simply, and Elena didn't press. On her desk lay a small cream envelope, neat handwriting across the front, Maggie. No title, no formality, just the name. She opened it quietly alone. "I don't ask for forgiveness. That's not mine to expect. I only ask that you know I was afraid, not of you, of what it meant to see you not fade." Lauren Maggie folded the letter and placed it next to her journal. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But her breath came a little easier, as if some long-tied knot had loosened, even just slightly. She walked to the shelf past the photos and the books she'd rearranged earlier and picked up the small porcelain cup. Its glued seams still showed like veins or fault lines, but it held together. For the first time since its breaking, she poured tea into it, not for symbolism, for herself. The heat seeped into her hands. She took a sip, quiet, steady. And for a brief moment, the years didn't feel so heavy. Outside on the balcony, the small pot where she had planted a flower was catching the morning sun. It had only just sprouted a few green shoots, reaching upward, defiant and unhurried. She turned toward it, still holding her cup, and whispered, "I think I'll keep the name Weller for a while longer. They asked me once if I had any regrets. I said only that I stayed quiet too long." The winter wind rustled through the bare branches above the garden bench. Maggie sat with her knees covered in a thick plum-coloured shawl, a notebook resting gently in her lap. The sky was a soft silver clouds, suspended like breath held too long, the kind of afternoon that whispered, not demanded. She picked up her pen and wrote slowly, carefully, not for speed, not for an audience. The ink bled a little on the page, cold air did that to paper, but she didn't mind. The day I was sent away, she wrote, "I thought something inside me had died." But maybe it was only the weakest part. Behind her, the soft crunch of shoes on gravel approached. Janet settled beside her without a word, at first watching a bird peck at the frozen soil near the walkway. "Still writing?" she asked after a moment. Maggie nodded. Janet glanced sideways. "Do you still hate him?" Maggie didn't answer right away. She let the question hang in the air like steam from a forgotten kettle. "Then no. I just regret raising a son who forgot his roots." Janet didn't press. Some truths didn't need discussion. A light cough broke the silence. Elena stood nearby, holding a folded paper in one hand. "I wanted to ask. The board is considering forming a resident council. They'd like a representative. Someone who's earned trust." She paused, then smiled. "I think you know who I'm talking about. Maggie chuckled softly, the sound surprising even herself. Me, I was once considered dead weight. Exactly, Elena replied. She nodded, thoughtful, before responding. I'll think about it. No promises. As Elena left, a woman Maggie had seen often but never spoken to stepped forward. Her gait was slow, careful, like someone recovering from years of holding in too much. Thank you, the woman said, reaching out with trembling fingers. For standing up. We saw it all. We just couldn't say it ourselves. Maggie took her hand gently. No grand speeches, no rehearsed lines. Just the warmth of two palms meeting a bridge between silences long held. In that moment, something quiet and resilient passed between them. A shared understanding. Not forged in words, but in presence. They sat like that for a while, as more residents drifted nearby. Some stood quietly. Others pretended to be gardening or organizing books on a shared shelf. But they were watching. Not with fear, not with pity, just awareness. As if something had shifted. A breath let out after years of holding it in. The wind stirred again, lifting a corner of Maggie's journal. She tilted her face toward the pale sun, letting it warm her skin. Maybe I'm not done speaking just yet, she whispered to the sky. And the trees, old and listening, said nothing, but they did not sway against her. They tried to erase me. But I remember who I am. The hallway was quiet, hushed, under the glow of soft yellow lights strung for the new year. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock ticked evenly, steady as a heartbeat. Maggie sat alone at the small writing table by her window, a thin wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and a familiar, slightly chipped teacup sat before her, filled properly for once, with just the right steep, just the way James had taught her. She brought the cup to her lips, eyes closed. The warmth spread slowly like a memory. Outside, the wind carried the faint crackle of distant fireworks. It was almost midnight. Another year, one she hadn't expected to see. Not truly. Not like this. A gentle knock on the door broke the quiet. A young nurse peeked in her voice, soft. Mrs. Weller, I brought your evening tea, though it seems you've already made your own. Maggie smiled. That's all right, dear. I like mine stronger anyway. The girl smiled back, placed the small pill cup on the side table, and lingered for a moment, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Happy New Year, Mrs. Weller. Thank you, Maggie replied. And thank you for calling me by my name. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence returned, not empty, but full. Maggie reached for her journal, the one with the worn edges and pages now filled with her own hand. She flipped to the last page. There, under the final entry, she wrote carefully, Today I was seen. She set the pen down her hand, lingering on the paper. A memory stirred, faint but clear. James, sitting across from her at their kitchen table years ago. His hands folded, his gaze serious. Promise me, he had said, if they forget you, you'll remember yourself. Don't let them name you what you are not. I promise, she had whispered then, and she whispered it again now. From the window, she could see the courtyard dimly lit. A few residents wandered near the edge, bundled in coats. A flicker of colour bloomed in the sky, red, then gold, then fading embers. Fireworks. Celebration without spectacle. Maggie stood. Her knees stiffened slightly, but she did not need help. She opened the window a few inches, letting the cold air slip in. It smelled of frost and faraway smoke. She looked outward, chin lifted. Her reflection in the window was faint, softened by the glass. But it was her. Still her. Behind her, the teacup sat untouched steam, curling upward like a ribbon toward the ceiling. There was no music, no speech, no applause, just the soft sound of a life reclaimed one quiet breath at a time. Maggie turned back to her journal. She added one final line, careful and slow, each letter solid on the page. They tried to erase me, but I was never written in pencil. She returned not with a shout, but with a name that could no longer be erased. The woman once called a burden had quietly reshaped the balance through truth resolve and the weight of what she remembered. Justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it echoes louder than all the years of silence that preceded it. Perhaps standing up today means no one else will have to bow tomorrow. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heavy Stories for more powerful tales like this.